Welcome to this new session. Today we are going to talk about disarmament and arms control. We have already discussed that states in international political arena face a security dilemma. And this security dilemma basically is created because the states have a lot of distrust with each other. They are not actually having any faith in their adversaries, and therefore, even if the adversary is doing something non aggressive, non violent, or not even intended against that particular country, the country always thinks that that action is being done to prepare for some kind of offensive action against it. So, because of this confusion, because of this dilemma about the intentions of the adversary, the states are always having some kind of an issue with their security. And therefore, this security dilemma, because of which states go to acquire more and more weapons, go in an arms race, is the basic problem because of which disarmament or arms control become a very serious challenge. So the argument is that why should states go for arms control and disarmament when they are constantly facing a security dilemma in the international political arena? Disarmament, to understand, simply means denying oneself or a country from possessing weapons or a certain category of weapons. It is actually the reduction or elimination of armaments which a country already has. Whereas arms control is concerned with regulating the armaments race or the arms race for the purpose of creating some kind of military stability. So therefore, disarmament is for weapons of the present times which states are possessing, whereas arms control is concerned with weapons of the future. So that needs to be clarified because quite often a lot of people do use these two terms interchangeably, and that is something which we should desist from doing when we are students of international relations. Now, disarmament could be of different varieties. One is the broad omnibus term of disarmament, which talks about elimination or reduction of weapons, but within that broad category, there are categories, or types of disarmament. One is the distinction between local or general disarmament. In general disarmament, all or most of the great powers participate. The example is the Washington Treaty of 1922, which was intended at limiting the naval armaments or the naval build up in the important countries of the time or the major powers, and it was signed by all major naval powers, and then the World Disarmament Conference of 1932. We talk about local disarmament when only a limited number of nations are involved. For example, the Rush-Bajot Agreement of 1817, which was an agreement between America and Canada, was an agreement which comes in the category of local disarmament. Similarly, disarmament could be qualitative as well as quantitative. Quantitative, as the name itself indicates, refers to an overall reduction of armaments or of certain types and categories. This generally was the goal of most of the countries who were represented in the World Disarmament Conference of 1932. Whereas qualitative disarmament aims at the reduction or abolition of only a certain types of armaments. For example, the Atomic Energy Commission of the United Nations, which talks basically about the atomic weapons. So if it is talking about quantity, irrespective of what the weapons are or what the category of weapons is, it is quantitative disarmament. And if it is talking about a certain category of weapons, it is called as quantitative disarmament. Now, another distinction is between total and partial disarmament. Total, as the name itself indicates, talks about elimination of all kinds of armaments. It does not apply to any particular, kind of weapons or category of weapons, whereas partial disarmament, of course, talks about certain particular categories of weapons. So that's the reason why it is called partial disarmament. If one were to look at the history of disarmament efforts, so if you look at it in the 20th century, it was the League of Nations basically which promoted the Naval Disarmament Conference among the big powers, the UK, the USA, France, Japan and Italy. And the basic operational mechanism was that there was some kind of a quota which was fixed, on the sizes of naval ships and the armaments they could carry. So the basic purpose was that there should be a certain limitation on the kind of naval ships which these countries could maintain, so that the other countries would not feel threatened, by the unlimited increase in the number of naval ships and the quality of weapons which were deployed on those naval ships. So this was also accomplished in the Washington and the London Naval Conference in the 1920s. And there were several other efforts, of this kind, consequent to these efforts in the 1920s. So during the interwar period, these efforts and initiatives which were taken at that time, the basic idea was that armaments basically have to be reduced because they are a cause of war. And if we are able to control the armaments, we would be eventually able to control war. However, with the rise of fascism and Nazism in the third decade of the 20th century, the issue of rearmament, not disarmament, eventually became a reality in Europe, ironically. Because these countries, went in a big way for rearmament, Italy and Germany. But after the Second World War, the world or the major powers of the world immediately after the Second World War started realizing the compulsion of disarmament. And it became even more intense with the appearance of the atomic bomb on the scene and the advances in weapon technologies, like they got jet-propelled long-range missiles. And only recently the atomic bomb had been used in Japan. So the kind of weaponry which was in the hands of powers actually underlined the importance of future sincere efforts towards disarmament among the big powers of the world. And it also led the UN to adopt disarmament as a high priority item in discharging its primary function of maintaining peace and security at the international level. So even at the level of the United Nations, it was realized that the world needs to now seriously think about disarmament, because we have now weapons of mass destruction, and even conventional weapons are getting more and more, precise and more dangerous. So therefore, it was realized that disarmament needs to be a very important item at the international agenda, and the UN needs to look at it very carefully and very sincerely as well. So, consequent to this, we also need to look at the idea of arms control along with disarmament, to understand that along with disarmament, how, arms control is also an important concept which needs to be understood in some detail. So, while disarmament is based on the assumption that the existence of weapons is the fundamental cause of uncertainty and conflicts, arms control is based on the assumption that the existence of weapons is not a cause, but a cause of only interstate conflicts. But rather, actually, it is a consequence of conflicts, interstate conflicts rather. So countries can have weapons, countries would actually have weapons, but once they have weapons, these weapons would not cause a conflict, but they are basically a consequence of, or the usage is basically the consequence of some kind of interstate conflicts. So while disarmament wants to eliminate armaments, arms control seeks to regulate the armament race for the purpose of creating some kind of stability. So typically, the arms control policies would aim at negotiating some kind of limits on the development, stockpiling, and the use of weapons. And these policies and the arms control can be rather grouped into three categories. One is arms reduction, then arms limitation, and finally, even arms freeze. So arms reduction policies seeks to lower the level of arms, whatever level the countries are at that particular point, that needs to be lowered. And this is sometimes even referred to as some kind of a partial disarmament. Whereas arms limitation policies attempt to limit the scope and the destructiveness of warfare and to prevent its accidental outbreak, to ensure that accidentally, we might not lead to enter into a situation where war is actually taking place. And finally, arms freeze policies aim basically at placing some kind of a ceiling or some kind of a limitation on the growth of certain categories of weapons or arms, so that the rival states on both sides feel comfortable at the military parity which they are able to attain. So if that is properly enforced, that is, an arms freeze is properly enforced, then the countries which are involved in that arms freeze agreement, they would be rather relatively satisfied, because they would know that the amount or the number of weapons of a particular kind which they are possessing, the enemy is having also the same number and category of weapons with it. So there is some kind of satisfaction that both of them are similarly placed, and it is an attempt to some extent reduce the kind of anxiety and tension which ensues in countries because of the security dilemma which they face at the international level because of cheating, lack of trust, and of course, distrust among countries of the world. If we go into the efforts, which have been made in the world in this direction of arms control and disarmament, we would see that during the interwar period, that is after the First War ended and the Second World War started, these efforts did not yield any kind of significant result. However, once the Second World War was over, the countries were very concerned and the hopes also rose about some kind of disarmament. Actually, many countries were at that time talking about general disarmament at the international level, because they had seen the horrors of the world and they were all too worried that if a similar war were to take place sometime in the future, it would be extremely disastrous, because they could not rather bear the economic and the physical losses which they had to face as a consequence of the Second World War. And now, if another war were to take place, it would be something too much for the international community to tolerate and endure. So that's the reason why there were a lot of hopes and rather a lot of emphasis was placed on general disarmament after the conclusion of the Second World War. And the immediate concern was the atomic weapons and technology. And it was brought up at the United Nations also that somehow some control should necessarily be put on the atomic weapons and technology, because it's something so very disastrous. In the year 1946, the United States rather, took the initiative to propose a plan which was known as a Baruch Plan for an international atomic development authority, involving inspection of all phases of production of fissile materials and it wanted to give this body exclusive rights to rather to promote peaceful uses of atomic energy. And it also was followed, and the suggestion was that it should be followed by relinquishing of atomic power by states in stages. So the idea was that since the atomic capability has been attained by countries like USA, so the idea was that it should be slowly wound up, and that atomic capability should even be relinquished slowly and gradually, and it should ensure, and need is there to ensure that this technology does not spread to other countries in the world. But the Soviet Union, of course, at that time, the Cold War was taking off, and the Soviet Union was not able to have faith in the Americans, and they thought that this is a plan to ensure that the Soviet Union is not able to acquire that kind of capability, and they are just trying to create some kind of a smoke screen behind which America would continue to acquire better capability or better nuclear capability. So they immediately rejected the plan and proposed another plan by the name of Gromyko plan for total prohibition of nuclear weapons. And of course, their plan was in turn rejected by the Americans. Later on in the year 1952, the UN, the Sixth General Assembly of the UN, established the UN Disarmament Commission. And the purpose was to prepare a draft convention for regulation, some limitation and balanced reduction of all kinds of armed forces and all armaments with countries of the world, and elimination specifically of weapons of mass destruction. So, as I mentioned earlier, that there was a need which was felt at the United Nations level that we need to move towards general disarmament, and because of that, that concern of countries, the UN Disarmament Commission had come into existence. In the year 1953, President Eisenhower of the United States put another very famous proposal before the UN, which was known as Atoms for Peace, and he suggested the creation of an international agency to promote the peaceful uses of atomic energy and to inhibit its use for military purposes. So ironically, you see that it was the United States of America which was the first country to make a nuclear bomb and then to also use that nuclear bomb in Japan. And now it was in the forefront of such kinds of talks where they are saying or advocating the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and rather to ensure that nuclear bombs, or nuclear uses in military have to be put to some kind of a stop. And after long negotiations, the ninth session of the UN General Assembly was able to adopt a resolution unanimously for the establishment of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is known as IAEA. And during much of the Cold War, both arms control and disarmament measures have been rather opted by or have been rather proposed by both the rival superpowers, USA and Soviet Union, to reduce tension and for strategic stability in the world. So there have been many plans and suggestions which have come from both sides regarding arms control and disarmament. And ever since the use of the atomic bomb in 45 in the at the very end of the Second World War, what happened that there was a lot of increase in the distrust on the side of the Soviet Union, because they realized that America, although it had informed earlier the Soviet Union about its nuclear capability, but the usage of that weapon was not informed to them. And the kind of impact it had on the international community was something very significant. And that created much more distrust in addition to what was already there in the minds of Soviet policymakers, that Americans are up to something and they cannot be trusted. And therefore, it created further hurdles in the path of future movement of the world towards any kind of disarmament or genuine disarmament proposals, or rather implementable proposals in the field of disarmament and arms control. In fact, many scholars doubted the intentions of these superpowers whenever they took a lead in proposing any proposal in coming forward with any kind of proposal relating to arms control and disarmament. There is a very prominent scholar, his name is Joseph Nogi, who came out with a very interesting Joker theory. What he argued was very interesting, and one could see that in the proposals which came from both sides, as we just now saw the plans, which came by the name of, Gromyko plan, which was coming from the Soviet Union, and the Baruch plan, which came from the United States, and many other proposals subsequently relating to disarmament and arms control. And Joseph Nogi argues that in all proposals, whenever the Americans came up with a proposal, they made it a point to come out with one such point in that set of proposals which they knew would be unacceptable to the Soviets. And they knew that the Soviets would never agree on that point. Similarly, when the Soviets came out with some set of proposals about disarmament or arms control, they would definitely make it a point to include one such point in that which they knew the Americans would necessarily not agree to. So the idea was that both of them were not very sincere when they were giving these proposals, and they wanted their proposals to be vetoed by the other party and vice versa. So when the Americans are coming with their proposals, there is something which they know that the Soviets would not agree, and they would definitely not agree with that. So the proposal will fall flat. And when the Soviet side will come with some proposals, there is something which they know the Americans will not like. So it also falls flat. So eventually what will happen, that nothing is actually happening, although there are proposals and counter proposals. So that is the reason why he calls it as a Joker theory. Like you have in a pack of cards, there are 52 cards if you buy a pack of cards, but there is one card which is the Joker, which is an additional card. So that does not have any value, and it is a valueless card. So similarly, if you play the game of cards and the Joker comes in, it spoils the game, because Joker is not part of the actual pack of 52 cards. So similarly here, any such proposal is a Joker proposal which kills the whole set of proposals and which is very deliberately inserted in the set of proposals. So now the question is that why would a superpower like America or the Soviet Union come up with a proposal which they know the other side is going to veto? The counter argument is that actually the purpose is that they don't want to do any disarmament, because they know that they would not be interested in doing any genuine disarmament because of the lack of trust. They know that even if party A, like America, agrees to actually disarm, they would have doubts whether the Soviets have actually disarmed or not. And similarly, if the Soviets reduce some weapons, they cannot be sure whether the Americans do it or not, because there are problems of verification, and there are so many other problems that they might conceal their weapons somewhere, and they might do all kinds of tactics they might adopt to ensure that compliance is not forced on either parties. So because of that, they know that disarmament measures would not succeed, but they have to show to the world also, to the international public opinion, that we are doing some disarmament efforts and we are very sincere about it, and we are not only rather going forward aimlessly in a mindless arms race. So to show to the world, to the international public opinion, that we are actually sincere about disarmament and arms control, they were coming up periodically with one proposal after the other proposal and so on, and they concluded many agreements also. Although to what extent these agreements were actually implemented is a big question that we will discuss in the next segment, that what were the agreements, to what extent they on paper agreed on these agreements, and to what extent, even if they agreed, whether those agreements were actualized or not. That is a big question, but nevertheless, they came on the table to discuss different issues regarding arms control and disarmament at various points of time from 1945 onwards, and many agreements were actually concluded. So this is the basic idea about arms control, disarmament, what is the distinction between the two, what are the categories in disarmament, and then how countries decide to go for disarmament despite the security dilemma they have, and what are the reasons why big powers would talk about disarmament and other countries also would be concerned about the issue of disarmament in the wake of the horrors of the Second World War, which made them rather talk about it sincerely and which eventually led to the United Nations creating a UN Disarmament Commission. Thank you.